Hello everyone, and welcome to our 5th video in our mini-series on comparative poetry. Last time we looked at Emily Dickinson's Because I Could Not Stop for Death, and we saw her perspective on the approach of death and the end of life. Today we're going to be analyzing Dylan Thomas's perspective on death in his poem, Do Not Go Gentle into That Good Night. Our first thing that we're going to do then is get to know Dylan Thomas on a personal level. And that's going to begin with understanding where he comes from and the time period that he lived in. So I know that he was a Welsh poet, so he came from the country Wales, and that he grows up not just in the context of one world war, but in the context of both of them. And this in part is going to heavily impact how he chooses to write because of the environment he grew up in, one where war was more of a reality, right, than a distant possibility. And we see that he chooses mostly to write lyrical and emotional poetry, and that oftentimes his poetry focuses on deep human emotion. We're going to see the human emotion related to death in our poem for today. And things that happened in his past that might account in part for why he chose to write the way he did include the fact that he gained this reputation of being a drunkard and a doomed poet. And it wasn't really a reputation that Thomas ever actively tried to deny. And in part, perhaps because of this, but more so because of the beauty of his poetry, he becomes very famous during his lifetime. Additionally, his father was a professor of English literature, and so growing up, he would have had this love of English and this surrounding of literature, including in part the fact that his father used to read him poetry, including the poetry of Shakespeare. So without further ado, let's go ahead and read our second poem, Do Not Go Gentle into That Good Night by Dylan Thomas. Do not go gentle into that good night. Old age should burn and rave at close of day. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. Though wise men at their end know dark is right, because their words had forked no lightning, they do not go gentle into that good night. Good men, the last wave by, crying how bright their frail deeds might have danced in a green bay. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. Wild men who caught and sang the sun in flight, and learn too late they grieved it on its way. Do not go gentle into that good night. Grave men near death, who see with blinding sight, blind eyes could blaze like meteors and be gay. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. And you, my father, there on the sad height, curse, bless me now with your fierce tears, I pray. Do not go gentle into that good night. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. This poem in particular is one of my favorites to study because it is so emotional, and by the end of the poem we learn that this entire thing is written for his father, who is lying on his deathbed, and it's Thomas pleading with him, cling on to life. And as we read for comprehension, we see that he exemplifies the reasons why his father should fight to stay alive, even if for a moment, by looking at all of these other figures who try to do the same. And so as we begin to read, we're going to go through each stanza, and just on a basic level, do we understand what he's saying? So not that deeper level yet, just on the surface. And here we see in this first stanza or tercet that our speaker is talking to an unknown listener, because at the time of our first reading, in the beginning, we didn't know who quite he was talking to, but we see that he is urging them not to accept the day's end. Again, at the beginning of the poem, we don't have that full concept of what the day's end stands for yet. Then we jump to our second tercet, and we see that now he shifts and he starts to talk about these wise men and how, although they know that the end of day is a logical thing, the end of day has to come, they still don't accept the night. So again, as a reader, we might be wondering, what's the big deal about not accepting the end of a day? And this question, right, as active readers, is going to help point us to that deeper meaning of what these things really stand for. Now we see in the third tercet that he turns once again to these good men, the second set of people, who also do not accept the night. Then he turns again to this third group of people, these wild men, men who, quite like himself, right, live life to the fullest. They enjoy it, but when it comes to a day ending, to night coming, they don't accept this reality. We come to our fifth stanza and that fifth tercet, and we see finally that now he turns to these serious men, because grave is a word that we can interpret in several ways. One of them being someone who takes things seriously or life seriously, but also that literal meaning of the grave, the place where you're buried. And this more literal meaning perhaps seems to make more sense because he says in those next set of words that the person is, or these people, are near death. But even they, on the brink of death, do not accept this dying of the light, this close of a day. And then finally we come to our sixth stanza, and here's where we see a quatrain rather than a tercet, so a shift in form. And we also now realize that from the very beginning, Thomas, our speaker, has been talking to his father, and he begs him not to accept night, which we now come to recognize represents death, but rather to fight against it. Now that we've read for comprehension, we need to then turn our attention to analysis. And as we begin to analyze, we're going to follow that same pattern of going stanza by stanza and identifying, starting off with form, meaning our rhyme scheme and our meter, and working all the way down to those deeper levels of figurative language to see what is Thomas saying. And the first thing we realize as we begin to discover the rhyme scheme of the poem is that it's going to begin this first tercet with a rhyme scheme of A, B, A, meaning that my first verse and my third verse rhyme with one another, night and light. And this is going to come to form a poetry type called Villanelle, which I'll explain once we've gotten a bit deeper into our rhyme scheme. But it's important that we have this rhyme of night and light because it points us to our next literary device, which is metaphor. So Thomas is going to use an extended metaphor where night and light do not just represent portions of the day, but also this greater idea of life and death. So for example, let's take night first. And I've gone ahead and I've colored these differently for you. Anything related to night, representing death, is going to be colored with black. Anything representing light or life is going to be colored with yellow. So just taking a look first at the metaphor in terms of death. We see that Dylan first highlights this first group, that people who are at the end of life, who are old in their age, shouldn't just accept this close of day, knowing that this close of day is a metaphor for death, or that moment where we pass from life into the afterlife, but rather that they should look upon these things that represent life. For example, they should not go gentle. They should fight against it, right? Cling to life. Not only that, they should cling with a ferocity that burns and raves. So all of these things in this tercet show us that death and life are battling one another. We're also going to see examples of assonance riddled throughout the poem. For example, we have old, should, okay? Into, night, rage, against. Okay? We're going to see all of these throughout the poem, and this is going to help in combination with the meter that we're going to pick up, which is mostly iambic throughout the entire poem itself. And these are going to work to create this rhythmic beat of the classic Villanelle that we see, something that gives it a romantic feel, similar to a romantic feel given in a Shakespearean sonnet, for example. And then finally, before we move on to our next tercet, we see here this beginning of a repetition. So here Thomas is urging people, not once but twice, rage or fight, battle against the moment of death. Don't accept it. And I want to highlight this last verse here and remind you of it as we get into analyzing the overall form of a villanelle. Okay? Because turning to our next tercet, we see that this rhyme scheme seems to repeat itself, right? Right rhymes with night and light. They rhymes with day. So we have A and B, but our rhyme in the third verse here in this tercet is not created, right, as something that's entirely unique. It hasn't been seen before in the poem itself. In fact, it's a repetition of that very first verse. So one of the things that we see in a villanelle is that it follows this rhyme scheme where after we finish that first tercet, the last verse in all of the remaining tercets is going to alternate in repetition between the first verse and the third verse. Okay. And this is something, by the way, that we call a refrain in literature, specifically poetry, when you have that final verse in a group of stanzas that repeats itself. Now we're going to jump back to our metaphor. So we call this an extended metaphor because it's a comparison that is made throughout the entirety of the poem and not just in one instance itself. So we continue to have dark representing death and anything with light representing life. And these continue to rage with one another. But now, rather than just raging within people who are old and close to death, it also rages within wise men. And it's interesting because the wise should know that death is coming. It's natural. No one is immortal in terms of humanity, and we can't escape death. But even they fight to hold on to life. And we see that they fight to hold on to this because they've realized that their words had forked no lightning. So if anyone's ever been outside during a lightning storm, if you've seen it from inside your home, you'll see that when lightning strikes, it has this rippling effect, and it's almost as if a hand comes down from heaven with all of these fingers of light shooting everywhere. And here, this lightning then is not just a metaphor for life, but a metaphor for the life-giving knowledge and wisdom that they had. And so these wise men struggle to stay alive because they realize that there's so much more life that they can give. Yeah? So one of the reasons why they in particular should rage against death. Then we come to our third tercet, and again we see this rhyme scheme continuing, but now, like we said, it's not the first verse that's being used as a refrain here, but now we have that third verse being repeated. Again, we have this metaphor being continued, and now here we're focusing more in a sense on the light because we're talking about these good men here, so men who are noble, of good character. He refers to them as the last wave by, so those most recent who had died, right? So remember the time period he grows up in. So that last wave would have been people who had fought in World War II. So as they begin to die out, right? And so here Thomas is saying that these men, even though they are older, even though they know they are frail, they still realize and cling to life because they know that those deeds, they can still do more. This idea of rather than that wave of the ocean crashing on the shore and dissipating or dying, it could dance or become part of this green bay. And green, a color, right, that we talk about in terms of symbolism as one being life-giving, right? If black then is something about death and decay, green is life. Think about the plants outside, right? So they believe that they still have more to give to life, hence why they also should rage, and they do rage against death. But also, I want to draw your attention here to this repetition again, not just in terms of the repeated verse, but also the repetition of rage. So we can really see the intense emotion that Thomas is trying to portray. Not just kind of try to fight against death, he's saying rage with all of your might against it. And in particular, not just death itself, but that moment of death, right, where the light begins to die. Coming then to our fourth tercet, we see again this rhyme scheme continuing. So we have that A-B pattern, and then now the repetition or the refrain of that first verse. Okay? Do not go gentle into that good night. And now we're taking this extended metaphor of life and death, and we're placing it in terms of wild men, so those who live life to the fullest. And Thomas describes these people as one who catch and sing the sun, so they fully grasp on to life, and they enjoy it. But what type of life do they enjoy? They enjoy life in flight, meaning life that's passing them by, because that's the reality. And Thomas is going to show us that they too realize, too late, that all of their process of living life to the fullest, they were actually grieving it. Because every moment we live that passes us by is fleeting. We can't get it back. It's gone in an instant. And in the same way, these men realized that as they were enjoying life, partying, having fun, they were really mourning it, especially as they begin to watch those around them die and succumb to this dying of the light. So they too are urged, right? Do not go gently. Then we come to our fifth tercet. Again, we have this rhyme scheme continued, and again, we have that refrain now of verse 3 from the first tercet, and our extended metaphor continues, right? And what's interesting, right, as we continue to go back and forth between light and day in these different tercets, it's as if a new day is rising every single time. And this is particularly interesting because each tercet, Thomas chooses to focus on this new group who fights against life. And here now, we see that this group is called grave men. So similar to those who are the old age or the last wave, people who are close to death. But even they, on the cusp of death, right, this dying of the light, they with blind sight see, right? Wait, but how does that make sense, right? We understand if someone is blind, they lack the capacity to see. Here we mean that on a physical sense. So although their eyes are becoming blind, right, they can no longer see, they have an internal metaphorical seeing, right, where they can understand that the best thing that they can do is not to die gently, but rather to blaze like meteors, and here to be happy and raging against the concept of death, even if for a moment. And again, we have that ending repetition that Thomas is urging us to rage against the light, or the closing of that light. And then finally we have this shift in form, and we have the end of a villanelle, which will always end in that quatrain. And this is going to be where Dylan packs us that emotional punch into the poem itself, and where we should feel the full intensity of the emotion that he is trying to get across, and that he does extremely well. And here we understand that he's speaking to his father. And in particular, in this rhyme scheme, I think it's rather interesting that he makes use of the villanelle in this way, because a villanelle in that final quatrain will always end with a refrain not just of that first verse, but of that third verse. So it's as if all of the advice he's been giving, alternating between rage against the dying of the light and don't go gentle into that good night, to those other groups, to his father he tells him both. So it's as if he's pleading double the amount he was with these other people to his father not to accept death. And that's an emotional thing to think about, right? Because his father, he's writing this poem for him. So we can imagine for ourselves his father on his deathbed and Thomas sitting by his side and urging him, please don't go. I'm not ready for you to go yet. We also see this repetition of that metaphor, that extended metaphor being continued, with night representing death and light representing day. And here he is talking to his father. So yes, you are on that sad height of death, so that the climactic moment of passing in from this life to the next. And here he says something interesting. Curse, but also bless me now with your fierce tears. And this seems rather odd, right? This paradox. How can we have these two things side by side? And one of the ways that we could try to interpret this, right, is curse me with your fierce tears, right? So maybe tears of understanding that we can fight death all we want, but eventually his father is going to succumb to death. just as all of the other figures in the previous tercets did before him. But also blessing in the sense that perhaps, right, bless me with these fierce tears, meaning that although you know the inevitability of death, your love for me encourages you to fight and to stay here, right? If this poem doesn't give you the feels, no other poem will. It's insanely intense how he makes use of extended metaphor to relay this human emotion, right? We should be able to feel the sadness that he feels. And by the end of the poem, we're raging along with him. Yeah, don't go, stay. So just a few analytical takeaways from this rather heavy poem. One of the things we need to clearly understand is that he is talking about the topic of death, and that in a different perspective than Dickinson, his theme might be phrased in one of two ways, right? Although death is inevitable, we shouldn't accept it without a fight. Or, another way to put it is to go out with a bang. So the last thing you do in life, make it big. And he makes use, in particular, of these four sets of literary devices to portray this message to us, right? The rhyme scheme that we see with the Villanelle, this repeated refrain urging those different people, and lastly his father, to avoid death, that you have more to live for. This metaphor of light being life and dark being death, and the moment of the closing of the day, or that setting sun, being that moment of death. We also talked about how assonance works with that meter of iambic feet to help create this light feel, but one that is also very romantic and musical, helping to add to the intensity of the emotion that the metaphor helps us to feel. And then finally, how the use of repetition helps to drive home the urging of Thomas to not accept death and to fight that moment. That's it for video number 10. In our next video, we're going to be comparing these two poems and the perspectives that they share on death. So what is Dickinson's view of death, and what is Thomas's view of death, and what themes do each communicate? And also, more importantly, how do they communicate these themes? I'll also be posting your sample essay this week. Remember, we're looking towards writing a comparative poetry essay. So I'll be giving you a sample one discussing Piano by D.H. Lawrence and Those Winter Sundays by Robert Hayden. And I'll post that so you have plenty of time to review it and see how I've taken my outline and transformed it into an essay for the essay that you will write, comparing the two perspectives of these poems. So Because I Could Not Stop for Death by Emily Dickinson, and Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night by Dylan Thomas. That essay won't be due until April 8th, so you do have a bit of time, but please do make sure that you check out the sample essay as I am posting it. Thanks for watching, and see you tomorrow.